Get on up.
Everybody right there.
Get into it.
Everybody right there.
Get involved.
Everybody just come on up.
Community organizations working to build a better Buffalo. Delighted to be joining you every Tuesday at 7 p.m. from now on. One of our partners is the Humanities Institute at UB. Today we're joined by Kari Winter, the director of the Institute, along with Judy Scales-Trent and Regina Mason to talk about the Reclaiming Our Ancestors Conference, focusing on racial justice and public history, running this Thursday through Saturday. Don't forget to follow PPG on Facebook and Twitter, and of course you can always get great information on our website, ppgbuffalo.org. The Public Good is sponsored in part by Univera Healthcare, real people who really care. Video of this show is on our Facebook page at facebook.com/ppgbuffalo, and you can find videos from previous week's shows on our YouTube page. Before we get started, I've got a very exciting other event to tell you about that's coming up. Thursday, October 26th, Mark Lamont Hill will be in Buffalo. Mark Lamont Hill, if you don't know him already, is a professor at Temple University, but he's also the host of BET News and a political contributor to CNN. His latest book is called Nobody: Casualties of America's War on the Vulnerable, from Ferguson to Flint and Beyond. Meanwhile, here in Buffalo, Buffalo high school students, inspired by Dr. Hill's book, are coming up with solutions to problems they're facing, ranging from bullying to lack of jobs. And activists have been organizing on both sides of Main Street for police accountability and reforms to make sure that nobody is treated like nobody. So join Open Buffalo for an evening of spoken word activism and a dynamic keynote from Dr. Mark Lamont Hill. Also, winners from Open Buffalo's first annual Youth Community Builder Contest will be announced. Over $10,000 of project funding, technology, and consulting expertise will be given to help the young people open Buffalo. So that is Dr. Lamont Hill, presented by Open Buffalo, Thursday, October 26th, 6 p.m., Bennett High School Auditorium at 2885 Main Street in Buffalo. Admission is free, but guests are asked to RSVP online. You can find out how to do that at the Open Buffalo website or on their social media. So hope you can join us for Dr. Lamont Hill, Mark Lamont Hill, presented by Open Buffalo, Thursday, October 26th, 6 p.m. at Bennett High School. Going to be an amazing evening. All right, now let's talk about reclaiming our ancestors, and let me introduce our guests. Kari Winter is a professor of American Studies at UB. She's the executive director of the Humanities Institute. She's published 2 books on American slavery, and she's also edited the 2005 edition of Jeffrey Brace's memoir of slavery called The Blind American Slave. Regina Mason, joining us over the telephone from California, is an author, speaker, and producer. She spent 15 years authenticating the pioneering narrative of her ancestor, William Grimes, who is the author of The Life of William Grimes, The Runaway Slave. She co-edited the 2005 edition of his book and produced the film Gina's Journey, The Search for William Grimes, which will be shown this Thursday at 7 p.m. to open the Reclaiming Our Ancestors Conference. Judy Scales-Trent is a professor emerita of law at University of Buffalo. Judy's career has included 12 years as a civil rights lawyer and 25 as a law professor. Her books include A Black Man's Journey from Sharecropper to College President, The Life and Work of William Johnson Trent, which tells the story of her grandfather. All right, well, wonderful to have you three here with us. We couldn't be more excited about the conference and delighted to help people learn more about it. Kari, why don't we start with you? Tell us the purpose of this. Why did you put together a conference called Reclaiming Our Ancestors?
I believe that one of the key features of slavery involves severing people from their ancestors and from their descendants. And this enforced a genealogical isolation, which is very devastating for individuals and communities. At the same time that slave traders and slaveholders severed people of African and American Indian descent from their ancestors, they also ended up creating the concept of whiteness, which alienated peoples of European descent from their own particular histories. So we find ourselves in 2017 living in a state of crisis as an amnesiac culture that has forgotten where we came from and what we're supposed to be about. So the concept of this conference is to connect the past more intimately and directly to the present in hopes of creating a better future in terms of racial justice.
It's really a conference that points back into the past but also forward into the future and is very much of the moment. What are some of the highlights? It's an incredibly rich conference, and folks really need to look at the website to see all the different events that are part of it. But if you could just call out a couple of things that people won't want to miss.
The most exciting thing for me is that we have quite a few descendants of authors of 18th and 19th century American slave narratives. These are an incredibly dynamic, rich, intellectually and creatively rich group of people who are doing things all over the country in terms of reclaiming and promoting the genuine history of African Americans. So descendants of Dred Scott, Jeffrey Brace, William Grimes, Solomon Northup, and many other people. We also have some of the leading figures in the study of African American literature, especially in the 19th century, coming to Buffalo. So it's going to be very, very exciting. I will mention one session that I'm really excited about right now. We're going to have a discussion of the difficult journey of justice featuring Tom DeWolf, who is a descendant of the largest slave trading family in American history, the DeWolfs of Rhode Island. He and 9 of his cousins went on a journey to understand their family's very nasty roots. And they made his cousin Katrina Brown made a film about their experiences called Traces of the Trade, and he wrote a book, Inheriting the Trade. And he has devoted his life since then to promoting kind of truth and reconciliation between descendants of slaveholders and descendants of slaves. And he also co-authored a book with a black woman who's descendant of slaves named Sharon Leslie Morgan, called Gather at the Table, and their joint journey is quite amazing. And then there's a professor from the University of South Florida named Julie Buckner Armstrong, who grew up in Alabama witnessing tremendous amounts of racism, and a lot of her research is focused on the history of lynching. And she's going to be giving a talk in honor of the 40th anniversary of the trial of Robert Chambliss, who was responsible for the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing that killed 4 girls in 1977. This is going to be, I think, a rich and multifaceted discussion, and it's going to be moderated by a descendant of Dred Scott named Lynn Jackson. And I can't think of anything more fitting than to have a discussion of the difficult journey of justice moderated by a descendant of Dred Scott, who was the plaintiff in the worst Supreme Court decision in American history, which was a decision that declared that the black man has no rights, that the white man is bound to respect. This was the worst, most horrific statement of racism in American history.
Thank you, Kari, and many, many other incredible speakers and panels coming up in this conference. We'll get a little taste of some of what we can expect by talking to 2 of the presenters. We'll start with Regina. Regina, you've edited a book about your ancestor. You've made a documentary film about him. But for those of us who don't know, who was your ancestor, William Grimes?
William Grimes was a very courageous man. He was born in 1784 in King George County, Virginia. He opens his book with biting sarcasm. He talks about being born in the land of the free, yet he was born a slave. He has 10 different masters throughout his life. He's very rebellious, but he knows who he is. He had at least 3 or 4 different slave names, but he always held on to his true identity. He escaped from slavery around 1815 with the help of black Yankee sailors who concealed him on a brig that sailed into New New York City, and this is while his master was away in Bermuda. He lived in New Haven, Connecticut, or in the state of Connecticut, for 9 years before his master finds him, and he was forced to give up the deed to his home for payment of his freedom.
So he bought his way. He bought his freedom by selling his house.
Yes, by selling his house and his business, his land. And so the family ended up being destitute. He was never able to regain the amount of financial means that he had when he was with property. And that's the first thing that you lose in terms of having a leg up in this country is your property. If you don't have property, it's very hard to make it in society, of course, even today.
Yeah.
And by the time his master found him, he was about 40 years of age. And of course, in those days, that was not necessarily an old man, but he certainly didn't have the same vigor to regain property. He was very fortunate to even buy property. He bought his property from a furniture maker in Litchfield, Connecticut, and there were people around him, poor whites, who at every turn tried to force him out of business. He was a barber by profession, and of course, at that time, barbers were typically black people, and so he was not only fighting a struggle to survive, but he was also fighting a struggle for a place for himself in society, when at every turn he was met with such terrible oppression and people trying to take him out of business. So he was a very courageous man. In the end, he wrote his life story for two reasons, I think. One was to recoup the money that he lost with the sale of his home, or having to give up his home, and the other was to just, as my co-editor Bill Andrews likes to say, he wrote his narrative like a list of grievances against the U.S.
Mm-hmm. And so when you were growing up, did you know that you had this incredible ancestor and what his story was, and were you familiar with the book that he had written?
Not at all. I knew nothing about this Grimes character, but there was a bit of family lore that endured for generations, and it came down to me when I was in the 5th grade during this 1970-71 school year. My Aunt Catherine, I went to her asking her questions about the family history, and she gave me what essentially amounted to 3 clues. She told me someone in the family with the surname of Grimes from New Haven, Connecticut, had a connection to the Underground Railroad. That floored me. I was just learning about American slavery and the Underground Railroad, and to know that I had an ancestor that in some way defied slavery was huge in my mind. And I asked her for more information, but she had given me all that she knew. So for 20-some years I thought about this Grimes character, and by this time I'm a young wife and mother, and I wanted to be able to offer my children their heritage. I wanted them to know their stories. So I thought, well, let me see if I can find any truth in this story. So I took a genealogy as a hobby, and after a measure of success with documents and census returns and so forth, I realized that information is out there. So then I turned my attention to William Grimes, and I began reading every abolitionist book I could find, every Underground Railroad book I could find, hoping to find a mention, however remote, of someone named Grimes.
Right.
And I found this mention. It was kind of crazy, crazy process, but I did find reference to a William Grimes who stowed away from Savannah, Georgia. And this was in Charles L. Blox's book, book, The Underground Railroad. And Bloxham's bibliography revealed to me that this William Grimes character had written his life story and published it himself.
You must have felt like miners striking gold when you found out that your ancestor had written a book.
Well, even finding the book, I still didn't know if this gentleman belonged to me. And William Grimes, his narrative doesn't read like a regular autobiography. Again, it reads like, as Dr. Andrews said, a list of grievances against the United States. He wasn't really writing to tell his family story. He was writing to talk about the injustices of slavery. But one little clue resonated in his book, and it was towards the end of the book when he mentioned his wife as Clarissa Caesar. And I immediately phoned my Aunt Catherine, and I asked her if Caesar was a family name. And, she said, I think it is, but I'm not sure. And then she said something that just moved me. She said, I have to get you the family Bible. All the family names are written in it.
Uh-huh. Wow. That's
amazing. This Bible then revealed the name William Grimes to me. It was just an
incredible,
remarkable journey of discovery. And it even still continues to this day.
And folks, you can learn about that journey from the film Gina's Journey, The Search for William Grimes, which will be shown at the opening of the Reclaiming Our Ancestors conference this Thursday at 7 p.m. Thanks so much, Regina, and we'll circle back to you in a moment. But right now I want to introduce Judy Scales-Trent, the emerita law professor from UB, who wrote a book about her grandfather, which is entitled A Black Man's Journey from Sharecropper to College President, The Life and Work of William Johnson Trent. So, Judy, tell us a little bit, who was your grandfather? Who was William Johnson Trent?
When I was a kid, we would take the train from New York City down to North Carolina every summer to visit family, and we visited my grandpa, and he was a college president in a very nice house right across from the college. And it wasn't until recently, maybe 15 years ago, that I found out that when he was born and raised, he was born in 1873 in western North Carolina. He was raised by his mother, grandmother, aunt, and uncles, all of whom had been slaves. And of course they had nothing. You get nothing when you finally get freedom. So they didn't have any land, they didn't have any house, they didn't have any farm tools, they didn't have anything. So they worked as sharecroppers, raising cotton and corn years and years. So my grandfather grew up as a sharecropper. He worked as a plowhand off the farm, helping other people by the time he was 10 years old.
And how did he make this incredible journey from sharecropper to college president? What were some of the key stages along the way?
That was my task. That was what engaged me, that question. How did he manage to do that? Probably the most exciting thing about the book to me is that I learned about the amazing energy and passion and drive of the black people who had been finally freed to build houses, build communities, start farms, build organizations, build schools, build churches, build fraternities and sororities. It was breathtaking. And so by time my grandfather was 17, which is when he ultimately went away to school, the black community in North Carolina had, the AME Zion Church had sent ministers down from New York City, where the church was founded in the 18th century, to help create schools for the black community. And so they created Livingstone College, and since there was no black high school, they also had to have a high school with it, and then they had an elementary school. So when he was 17, he started in the 4th grade and graduated from college 7 years later. The black community also was creating YMCAs back ever since 1850. And the Y at that time was not swimming classes. It was created in England around 1850 as a place for young men who were leaving farms, going to cities, so they would be safe. They would have Bible classes, a place to stay, a place for sports, a place to read. And the black community had started creating these Ys from 1853. The first one was in New York City. So his first job after college was as a Y leader for a black regiment in the Spanish-American War, and then he was a Y leader for the next 25 years in Asheville and in Atlanta, Georgia. And then his alma mater called him back in 1925 to become the 4th president of Livingstone College.
Now, when you were growing up and visiting your grandfather, would he ever tell you stories about his youth as a sharecropper?
No, I never knew anything about this. I was the 8th of 9 grandchildren, so we didn't have a lot of conversations. There was a lot of competition. But no, I never learned anything about his childhood. As far as I knew, he had always been a college president.
Yeah. And then what sources did you use to find out the story of his whole life?
When I was in the basement one day in my house, I came across an interview with him in 1950, so he was around 70, almost 80 years old. And the interviewer had given the interviewer an outline of his life. So I had a plan I could follow. I had a plan I could follow. And he was in these organizations that kept records. The AME Zion Church, Livingstone College, the YMCA. And because he was the director of these organizations, or president, his name figured prominently. So I could go to Minneapolis, where the YMCA records are, and I could say, what do you have in the what they call the Colored Men's Department of the Y between 1900 and 1925? And the archivist started rolling out carts and carts of material.
Wow. It's amazing. So these stories, they're very inspirational. They're stories of amazing, heroic people. They're stories that have a lot of resonance for you, of course, because they're your ancestors, but then for anyone who's interested in history. But they also tell us a lot about issues that we're facing today. So I want to ask you a little bit for some reflections on how the quests that you've been engaged in relate to the issues that we're facing today, issues around racial justice, issues around who gets to tell what stories, and how the truth is manifested or not. What are some of your thoughts about the relevance of these topics today? Kari, go ahead.
I'll give you one little slice. Right now, a lot of us are thinking about the protest against violence against African American men, police violence, and as everyone in the United States who's sentient today knows, there's a huge confrontation between Colin Kaepernick and NFL players who are taking the knee, and the president and many reactionary forces in this country. A lot of people have been writing into the Buffalo News saying we need to honor our troops. So I would ask the question of who are our troops? If you look at the story of Jeffrey Brace was kidnapped, stolen from his own life in the mid-18th century. He was transported at the age of 16 to Bridgetown, Barbados, where before he could speak English, he was turned over to an English military officer named William Burke, who trained him in the military discipline. A gun was put in his hand, and he was put on an English ship as an enslaved sailor soldier and participated in the British siege of Havana, Cuba. One of the major battles in the Caribbean arena. In battle that he should be named Jeffrey, and then he took him to New Haven, Connecticut, and sold him into slavery to a sadistic Connecticut Yankee. Jeffrey Brace was enslaved in Connecticut, passed through a series of quite sadistic masters until he was purchased by a grandmother named Mary Stiles. He descended then to her son, Benjamin Stiles, and when the American Revolution broke out, he enlisted in that war, not to earn freedom from taxation, but to earn literally his freedom. He fought for 7 years and was honorably discharged with the Badge of Merit at the end of the war. I found records about this in the military archives in Washington, D.C., pretty long records about his military service, which is published in my edition of his book. I just want to point out, Jeffrey Brace's descendants are sons and daughters of the American Revolution. Their ancestors' military service even predates the American Revolution, when Americans still thought of themselves as Englishmen. And his great-grandson, Peter Brace, fought in the American Civil War on the side of the Union, obviously, in the Massachusetts 54th, which was the all-black regiment that was basically used as cannon fodder. But he survived that. Descendants of the Brace family have fought in almost every American war. So, up to the present day, one of their descendants, one of their children is in Afghanistan. But Leon Brace, who was many generations later, fought in World War II. He was a fair-skinned man known as Black in northern Vermont, again, a son of the American Revolution. In World War II, he had to fight in a segregated Black regiment. And when Black veterans came back from World War II, they faced enormous economic discrimination and violence, in many cases faced lynchings. So if we talk about honoring our troops, let's talk about all of the Black troops that have fought in every American war and still are subject to enormous discrimination in this country.
And make up a disproportionate share of today's armed forces. Gina, same question for you. How do you relate the amazing historical work that you've done to conditions facing us today?
There's so much to say about it, but I want to point this out in particular. Kari did mention the prison system. When I read William Grimes' story, and I look at how he was thrown into jail just because he resisted the system, and he talks about how he couldn't be governed in the way that it was intended, and that every whim for the slightest infraction, if he didn't beat the harmony to the satisfaction of the mistress, he risked being thrown actually into jail because he was incorrigible. And we can go back to those days and realize where that system of prison and control was implemented, and it certainly resonates back to the days of slavery.
Absolutely.
And not a lot has changed. Black men are imprisoned for slight offenses longer than white men who may have done the same offense, but typically blacks are in prison longer. That resonates with me, and I also want to say this about why this journey that I have been on is so important to me. I learned by William Grimes' example to take history into my own hands. I did not look for others to, certainly I had help along the way, and I don't want to diminish that, but I want to say that the voices that we lost, the people that we've lost, we honor them when we go back and we reclaim who they were and how they made an impression on us going forward. So we have to reclaim our history.
All right, Regina, I'm sorry to say we're out of time, so I have to cut you off, but that was a perfect summation and a great inspiration for everyone to turn out to the Reclaiming Our Ancestors conference this week. Probably the easiest way to find out more is just Google Reclaiming Our Ancestors Conference. I test drove that earlier today. That works out fine. That'll take you to the conference page, and you can find out about all the amazing events going on this Thursday through Saturday. So thank you so much to our guests for telling us about it. See you all at the Reclaiming Our Ancestors Conference, and we'll be back with you next Tuesday at 7 p.m. for the public good here on Power 96.5 FM and Mix 1080 AM.
Everybody over there.
Get on up.
Everybody right there.
Get into it.
Everybody right there.
Get involved.